Hello. I'm reading a report on the BBC that will once again reignite criticism of the UN and its alleged inefficiency as an organisation. Um, I do want to be careful with my wording here because the UN is a huge organisation, obviously, and I share a lot of the cynicism and I share a lot of the criticism, but I don't know what the alternative is. Anyway, I'll come to that point afterwards. I'm just going to paraphrase this report, at least the first part of it. The World Health Organization has appointed President Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe as a Goodwill ambassador to help tackle non communicable diseases. New WHO head Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, praised Zimbabwe for its commitment to public health. But critics say Zimbabwe's healthcare system has collapsed, with the president and many of his senior ministers going abroad for treatment. They say that staff are often underpaid and medicines are in short supply. Dr. Tedros, who is Ethiopian, is the first African to head the WHO and replace Margaret Chan, who stepped down from her 10-year post in June. I wasn't aware of that actually until I read this report. He was elected with a mandate to tackle perceived politicization of the organization. Now, that is an important point, which I will come back to. The WHO head praised Zimbabwe as a country that places universal health coverage and health promotion at the center of its policies to provide health care to all. But US based campaign group Human Rights Watch said it was an embarrassment to give the ambassador role to Mr. Mugabe given his track record in human rights. If you look at Zimbabwe, Mugabe's corruption, his utter mismanagement of the economy, has devastated health services there, said Executive Director Kenneth Roth. Not going to read out the whole report because it's quite long. Um, it's also been pointed out that there is an irony in this because a number of African heads of state and heads of government, including Mr. Mugabe, have went abroad for health treatment. So clearly they don't trust their own health systems with their own healthcare. Now, this year Zimbabwe has suffered serious flooding. Almost 300 people have died. So I imagine that's going to put even more strain on the healthcare system. For me, the issue isn't that Zimbabwe is better or worse than any other country, particularly in Africa, in terms of its healthcare. It may be that there are one or two tick boxes that Mugabe has done right. Few leaders are all bad, but Mugabe, nevertheless, is a dictator. He has presided over appalling mismanagement of the Zimbabwean economy. Bear in mind, Zimbabwe was once the breadbasket of Africa. It's now, well, we all know how awful the economic situation has been. I mean, when we look at the levels of inflation, the level of corruption, added to this is the brutal treatment of white farmers, the brutal treatment of dissidents, Mugabe's own demagoguery. This is a man who compared himself to Hitler. Um, so I could definitely understand why this is controversial. It looks like once again the UN is just awarding someone for political reasons who really doesn't deserve it. Now, this line about he was elected, referring to the Ethiopian head, Mr. Ghebreyesus, with a mandate to tackle perceived politicization of the organization. Now, how I interpret that is that for a very long time, regimes that have presided over severe corruption and particularly human rights abuses have used this line that the UN is biased against them. So I suspect this is a way of just kind of tempering that criticism. It would be like making China in charge of the world leader on internet freedom. I mean, wherever you get authoritarian regimes, they criticize the UN as being biased towards Western democracies. Now, you might argue that it is biased towards Western democracies, but that's clearly why this has happened. So the focus isn't really on which country has been exemplary in healthcare. The focus has been on trying to placate tyrants, in this case, Mugabe. Another glaring example of this was when Saudi Arabia was put onto the UN Human Rights Council. Now, optimists may say, well, this could be a way to force these countries to change their ways. I wish I could believe that, but I think it's much more likely that they're just being, it's rewarding tyranny. I mean, Saudi Arabia, for goodness sake, there are few countries that are worse when it comes to human rights. Notwithstanding the situation of how women are treated, which was, I mean, only in the last few weeks have women been allowed to drive. And since then, those who have been attacked by hardline conservatives. I mean, Saudi Arabia, for goodness sake, this is a country where atheism is a crime. Look at the treatment of Raif Badawi, the brave young man whose only crime was to blog dissent. And the kingdom has brutally whipped him, treated the wounds, whipped him again. I mean, I don't even need to talk about how awful a human rights record Saudi Arabia has, and the other Gulf states aren't much better. Um, So I can, and and we're not innocent in this because countries like my country, like the UK, have helped to get these rogue states onto. I mean, Britain actively helped to get Saudi Arabia onto the UN Human Rights Council, and as a Briton, I'm ashamed of that. I think we were wrong, and I think it was all to do with politics. I think it's about political maneuvering in the region. I believe that for far too long we have been far too closely tied to the Saudi regime. And I'm not so naive to think that, okay, we could just completely divorce any sort of relations. But given if it's supposed to be a mutual relationship, we should be a lot more vocal on human rights areas. And I think this is one of the main criticisms of Western countries when it comes to human rights. Firstly, our own track record is not squeaky clean. But secondly, it's a perception of being biased because we will support one regime whilst criticizing another. So, as much as I abhor the regime in Iran, which is an appalling regime, which does have an awful human rights record, it's hard to argue when they say, oh, but the West backs Saudi Arabia, which is just as bad. Well, they won't use those words, but it's true. Saudi Arabia and Iran, when it comes to human rights, are as bad as each other. But, you know, the West is silent on Saudi Arabia, and it's not good enough. One of the main motivating factors, in fact, that came about during Arab Spring, both as a factor in the uprisings, but also in terms of the criticism against the West, was that we don't have a consistent track record on who we support. Um, there have been times I've defended the West, but this is something that we can't shy away from. We are inconsistent. Um, so that brings me to the next question about the wider relevance of the UN. I don't think the UN should be abolished because I honestly cannot see any other alternative at the moment. And that's something I would ask people to consider when you say, oh, the UN's useless, it should be abolished. What other alternative is there? We know that the UN formed after World War II, ostensibly as a way for nation states to talk to one another instead of always going to war. Well, we know since then there have been some very bloody conflicts, and there have been countless examples of despotic regimes and too many human rights violations to name. So the world has not been, if those countries that signed the UN Human Rights Charter in 1945, 46, if they knew what this was going to be like, I don't know. Maybe they were realists. Maybe they knew it wasn't ever going to be a utopian situation. But the problem is, if the UN is supposed to function as a collection of world states working together, then unfortunately it has failed on too many occasions. There has been examples of. I mean, I don't want to get into a very lengthy video about all the flaws of the UN. Believe me, that would take all day. Um, the truth is, by its sheer scale, perhaps this is the problem. By its sheer scale, because it is virtually a worldwide organization, then it's always going to be flawed because you're never going to get every single country absolutely agreeing with a particular issue. So perhaps it's always going to be flawed. But then what is the alternative? Because we have these sort of regional organizations, the European Union, the African Union, ASEAN, and so forth. Um, I think there's always going to be criticism of the UN. Perhaps it's time, perhaps the only alternative is sometime in the coming few years we need to have a UN Mark II. But how we go about that, I don't know. I don't believe in breaking up the UN because I can't see, firstly, that overlooks many of the good work that the UN has done. And we can't overlook that either. There has been enormous good work done by organizations like UNICEF and UNESCO. Um, there have been, and that's something that we can't overlook. With all the criticism, we shouldn't overlook progress that has been done, and there has. But things like this do make a mockery of the UN, and I think Dr. Tedros needs to really answer these questions. Why is he awarding Zimbabwe, or particularly Mugabe? Because when we say Zimbabwe, it is Mugabe, given that he has an iron grip on the country. Why is he rewarding Mugabe despite this appalling human rights record? And I think it's basically Pan Africanism. I think it's a way of Dr. Tedros saying, oh, I'm an African, Mugabe's an African, so I'm going to give it to Mugabe. Um, it's just not good enough. And it's things like this that really do damage the credibility of the UN. And like I say, Western countries are also partly to blame for their inconsistency. And when you get powerful countries like the United States failing to take responsibility in climate change, that also damages credibility. So there's a lot of areas that the UN is deeply flawed, but for now, I just don't see any alternative. It may be that I make another video specifically on the UN, but all I would say is if you believe the UN should be abolished, what other alternative is there? I think it's better to reform from within and to push these issues. It can be despairing at times. It can seem like nothing ever changes, but I would say that it's a huge organization. It's worldwide, and it isn't all bad. There has been good work done by the UN as well, and people shouldn't overlook that. Okay, let me know your thoughts, and thank you for watching.